Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel Amir Hashem. Today, we will be learning Daf Kuf Pei Beis Amid Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchas Shabbos. We pick up today on the very bottom line of Kuf Pei Aleph Amid Beis, in the middle of the words, well, actually at the words of the Ramah, in Siman Shin Lamed Vav, Sif Yod Aleph, bottom line, Hagah. Our learning today should be a schus for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael, Hanesunu Batzara Bashivya, Haim Dem Ben Bayom Uben Bayabasha, Hamakim Yerachem Alehem, V'Yitziam Yitzara L'Rvacha, Me'afela La'Oiro Mishibud L'Geula, Hashta Bagalo V'Zman Kariv and Emar Amen. Our learning should be a schus for Fuy Shalema, for Esther Fradel Baschana, Meshamer ben Esther Fradel, Yitzchak ben Tzion ben Dusha, Yoshua Levi ben Ahuva Malka Chana, Rivka Bashiralea Chavadasa Baserol. They should all have a Fuy Shalema B'Soshar Chele Yisrael. And as always, we are mispal that b'schus the liman haTorah of Klal Yisrael, Rebbe Shalom should watch over every member of Klal Yisrael b'chol makom shehem. Okay, a halacha here in the Ramah that could be negeya very much on Shabbos. People like to buy, not people like to buy, it's a nice thing. People buy flowers for their wives for Shabbos. Says the Ramah Hagah, Umuter lahamid anfe ilonois b'mayim b'Shabbos. You're allowed to put branches of trees into water on Shabbos, and we're not worried that that presents a shaila of zoreya. There's going to be a couple of caveats, but high level, the Ramah is saying you have branches of trees that are pretty. Same thing would be flowers. You have flowers that are pretty. You're allowed to put them into water on Shabbos. Caveat. Ubelvad shelo yiyu behem prachim v'shoishanim shehem niftachim milachluchis hamayim. However, if there are flowers, if there are buds that are going to open because you put them into the water, so if you have flowers that are not fully open and they're going to open by virtue of you putting them into the water, or the Mefarshim say, if whatever you're putting into the water is going to grow, if it's going to get bigger by virtue of you putting it into the water, then you're not allowed to do this, because then it is zoreya. If you take a rose, and it's a closed rose, and you put it into the water on Shabbos, and because you put it into the water, and it's drinking up the water, now the rose is going to open, then it is zoreya. That is a form of growth. We look at that as a form of growth. It's changing by virtue of the fact that you put it into the water. So, you're allowed to put branches, you're allowed to put pretty things into water on Shabbos, as long as it's not going to be any form of zereya. As long as nothing's going to take place, it's not going to open or grow by virtue of the fact that you put it into the water. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois katan and gimel lahamid anfe ilonois. Shekaitzin, these are branches that people cut b'maisachama during the summer months, l'smayach behen babayis, to bring simcha into the house. They're pretty to look at. Maybe they smell nice. And there's another caveat that the Chavetz Chaim puts in here. He says you must say that the Mechaber is addressing a case shehu chanu me esmoil lakach, where these branches were muchan before Shabbos. Like this, the branch of a tree is eitzim va'avonim. Eitzim va'avonim amuksa machmas gufay. So you go out into the backyard on Shabbos and you see a pretty branch with pretty leaves on it. You're not allowed to pick it up and bring it into the house. They're eitzim va'avonim. They're muksa machmas gufam. But if you have flowers that were muchan before Shabbos, if they were prepared, so to speak, and over here, even a mental designation would be enough. If they were prepared for Shabbos use, yes, I want these on my dining room table on Shabbos, then they are no longer muktzah, and then this halacha would be true that you could put them into the water. Now, the Ramah ends off over here on the top line of Kuf Pei Beis Amud Aleph, and he says, V'ayin likamon simin tov reish nun daled. Now, simin tov reish nun daled is Hilchas Lulav. What halacha in Hilchas Lulav is the Ramah sending us to? And that is the topic of Mishnah Berurah Katan Nun Daled, says the Chavetz Chaim. V'ayin likamon simin tov reish nun daled. Now, I have to tell you, before we even read the words of the Mishnah Berurah inside, that this Mishnah Berurah is a little bit strange, and I'll show you why. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Ritzainer Loimar, when the Ramah is sending us to Tov Reish Nun Daled, why is he sending us there? What he wants to say is, Disham Mavur, because over there it is explained. De'enai mutter b'Shabbos, the only thing that's mutter on Shabbos, ki im lahachzir b'mayim, sha'amdu by mikfar be'erev Shabbos. The Ramah says over here, mutter lahamid anfei lonis b'mayim b'Shabbos. You're allowed to take these branches and you're allowed to put them into water. Now, if you would just read that phrase, and somebody would ask you a shaila, I have these pretty branches that were muchan for Shabbos use. I designated them for Shabbos use before Shabbos. Now, on Shabbos, I want to take a vase. I want to fill it up with water. I want to take these branches and I want to put them into the vase. Is that mutter or aser? Well, a simple reading of the Ramah over here, mutter lahamid anfi lonis b'mayim b'Shabbos. It sounds like, go ahead, fill up a vase with water, take the branches, put them in on Shabbos. Says the Mishnah Berurah, not so fast. If you go to Taf Reish Nun Daled, over there it would seem, and I'm going to translate the words the way the Chavetz Chaim wrote them. The Sham Mavur over there, it's explained. The Einoi Mutter b'Shabbos, the only thing that's mutter on Shabbos, Ki im lahachzir b'mayim, is to return the branches to water. Sha'amdu by mikvar be'erev Shabbos. The only thing that's mutter is if the branches were in water on Erev Shabbos, and on Shabbos they were taken out. Maybe you wanted to show them to somebody, or you wanted to pass them to somebody to smell them, right? So they were taken out of the water. Now you're allowed to put them back into the water. But you wouldn't be allowed to add fresh water to the vase. And certainly, you're not allowed to take the vase, pour out the water, and exchange it for fresh water. And according to this, according to this interpretation, based on Taf Reish Nun Daled, says the Chavetz Chaim, according to this interpretation, so when the Ramah said, lahamid anfei ilonis b'mayim b'Shabbos, he didn't mean it the way we took it. He didn't mean you could fill up a vase on Shabbos with water and stick the branches in. All he meant was you could return them to the vase. Even if you took the pretty branches out of the vase, you could put them back in. But you can't set up a vase with water initially on Shabbos and stick the branches in. Okay, so says the Chavetz Chaim, and the Chavetz Chaim says that this is based on Taf Reish Nun Daled, and this is why the Ramah is sending us to Taf Reish Nun Daled. So again, simple reading of the Ramah sounds like I have these pretty branches that I cut on Erev Shabbos. I prepared them for Shabbos use, so they're not muktzah. Now on Shabbos, I'm afraid they're going to wilt. I could take a vase, fill them up with water, stick the branches in. That's what a simple reading of the words of the Ramah on the bottom of Kuf Pei Aleph Amud Beis would seem to yield. Says the Mishnah Berurah, no. Because if you take a look at Taf Reish Nun Daled, you'll see that that's not true. Sham Mavur, over there it's explained, says the Chavetz Chaim, that no, you're not allowed to do that. What are you allowed to do? If the branches were already in a vase of water on Erev Shabbos, and you took them out of the vase on Shabbos, you could put them back. But you can't set it up initially on Shabbos. Not only that, if you set it up on Erev Shabbos, and now you want to add water on Shabbos, you're not allowed to do that either. You're also not allowed to dump out the water and put in fresh water on Shabbos. And the Chavetz Chaim says that this is all Shab Mevur in Taf Reish Nun Daled. Now the problem is, if you take out a Chelik Vav, and you take a look at Taf Reish Nun Daled, you're not going to find this, because it actually doesn't say this in Taf Reish Nun Daled. In Taf Reish Nun Daled, what the Shulchan Aruch says is, a woman is allowed to take the lulav from her husband. So Tati comes home from shul with the lulav, with the hadassim and the aravas, hands them off to his wife. His wife is allowed to take them, and she's allowed to put them into the water. And not only is she allowed to put them into the water, but on Yom Tiv, in Taf Reish Nun Daled, we're talking about Yom Tiv, we're not talking about Shabbos. In Taf Reish Nun Daled, the Mechaber says, on Yom Tiv, the woman is allowed to take the lulav, the hadassim, and the aravas from her husband, and she's allowed to put them into the water, and she's even allowed to add water. That's what it says in Taf Reish Nun Daled, because Taf Reish Nun Daled is not talking about Shabbos at all. And you know why Taf Reish Nun Daled is not talking about Shabbos? Because we don't take a lulav and esrog on Shabbos, right? Gzeira, we're afraid Shemi Avirenu Daled Amis Berushas Harabim. So we don't take Daled Minim on Shabbos. So why would the Mechaber tell us the halacha of Daled Minim on Shabbos? So in Taf Reish Nun Daled, the Mechaber is talking about Daled Minim on Yom Tov. And on Yom Tov, the Mechaber says The woman could take it, put it into the water, and she could even add water. What the Chavetz Chaim is talking about over here really comes from a Mishnah in Masechta Sukkah on Daf Mem Beis. The Mishnah in Sukkah on Daf Mem Beis says what the Mishnah Berurah says over here very clearly. The Mishnah does address the question of Shabbos. And the reason the Mishnah addresses the question of Shabbos is because during the days of the Mishnah, we did take Daled Minim on Shabbos. This was a later Gzeira that we don't take Daled Minim on Shabbos. At the time of the Mishnah, they took Daled Minim on Shabbos. So the Mishnah addresses the question of Shabbos. And the Mishnah says over there, Shitas Reb Yehuda, that you're allowed to put the lulav into the water. You're allowed to put it back. You're allowed to be marzir it. You're allowed to put it back into the water on Shabbos, and you're not allowed to add water. And you're also not allowed to switch out the water. And why is this? It's not a problem of Zereya. That's not a problem. The problem is Tirchi Yisera. The problem is, and it's very interesting that we're worried about Tirchi Yisera over here, but over here we're worried about Tirchi Yisera. That we hold that it's a Tirchi Yisera on Shabbos to go get a vase, fill it up with water, stick the branches in. That's considered Tirchi Yisera. To add water, Tirchi Yisera. To switch out the water, Tirchi Yisera. But if you have the vase with the water set up from before Shabbos, then you're allowed, and the branches were taken out on Shabbos, you're allowed to put them back. It's not a problem of Zereya, and it's not an issue of Tirchi Yisera. We don't look at that as a Tirchi Yisera. And this, the Mishnah Berurah continues, he brings this down from the Tosefes Shabbos v'Chai Adam. Now, continues the Mishnah Berurah, and he says, V'yesh achronim, however, there are achronim, and if you look in Ois Katan Mem Ches, in the Sharet Zion, he brings down the Pri Megadim, the Shulchan Aruch HaGraz. He says, V'yesh achronim, there are achronim shesovrim who don't agree with this. And they say, the midasasam harav, it's not hamachaber, it's harav, it's the Ramah. Midasasam harav, from the fact that the Ramah wrote this in such a general way, on the bottom line of Kuf Pei Aleph Amud Beis, Mutter lahamid anfei lonis b'mayim b'Shabbos, midasasam harav, mashma dafilu lechatchila mutter lahamida b'kad sheyesh b'mayim mizumonim me'erev Shabbos, that what the Ramah must mean, yes, you're not allowed to go ahead and prepare the vase with water on Shabbos. Mishnah, Sukkah, Mem Beis, that's too much of a Tirchi Yisera. But if you filled up the vase on Erev Shabbos and you prepared the vase, then you could take the branches and you could put them into the water on Shabbos. What's the Tirchi Yisera? That's no different than putting them back into a vase that they were removed from on Shabbos. The Tirchi Yisera could be preparing it initially on Shabbos. But if you prepared the vase with the water in it on Erev Shabbos, and now you want to put the branches in on Shabbos, that would be mutter. V'loi asru elo lahaisav ata mayim, it's also to add water now, mishum tirchi yisera, or to switch out the water, or to prepare the vase initially. But if the vase is prepared with the water and you want to put the branches in for the first time on Shabbos, that would be mutter. V'dan, you should know, the b'yesh ben prachim, sheniftachim, again, the Mishnah Berurah wants to emphasize, if there are flowers or blossoms that are going to open, machmas hamayim, because of the water, if you have an issue that you have blossoms, flowers that are going to open because of the water, then I don't care when you prepared it. You're not allowed to put it into the water on Shabbos because that would constitute Zayreya. Moving along to Sif Yud Beis, the end of the top line, Kuf Pei Beis Amud Aleph. Says the Mechaber, Te'enim, figs, Sheyavshu B'ibehen. So you have a fig tree, and you have figs growing on the tree, and the figs have started to dry out. You left the figs on the tree too long. Most fruit fall off the tree when they ripen. Apparently, figs do not always fall off the tree. And if you leave them on the tree, they'll dry out and they'll shrivel on the tree. So says the Mechaber, Te'enim sheyavshu b'ibeyan, if you have figs that dried up on their stems, b'ibeyan means on their stems, v'chein, similarly, ilan sheyashu peiroisav boy. According to the first pshat in the Mishnah Berurah, this means, v'chein ilan, any other tree, besides a fig tree, sheyavshu peiroisav boy, if it happened that the fruits on any particular tree dried up and shriveled while they were still on the tree, albeit that's unusual, but if it did happen, if you have an apple tree and an apple dried up and shriveled and it remained on the tree, you should know that if you pick that dried up, shriveled fruit off the tree, it's still an Issa Daraisa of Toilish. Afapi shehem kakurim le'inyan tuma. The Mechaber explains why he had to tell you this halacha. The reason he had to tell you this halacha is because we know that fruits are capable of being makabel tuma. An apple is a meichel, it could be makabel tuma. It has to be huchshar lekabel tuma, it has to get wet. Until it gets wet, it can't be makabel tuma. But once an apple gets wet, it's a meichel, it's a food item, it could be makabel tuma. However, an apple cannot be makabel tuma while it's on the tree. Because while a fruit is on the tree, it's not considered a meichel. While a fruit is on the tree, it's considered tree. A tree is mechubal karka. A tree cannot be makabel tuma. So an apple connected to the tree can't be makabel tuma. A fig connected to a tree can't be makabel tuma. But if a fruit shrivels up on the tree, now it's no longer considered mechuber le'inyan hilchas tuma. In the context of hilchas tuma v'tara, once a fruit shrivels up on the tree, it's no longer considered connected to the tree because it's no longer drawing nourishment from the tree. It's dying on the tree. Once it shrivels up on the tree, it could be makabel tuma. So, in the context of the halachas of tuma and tahara, once a fruit begins to dry out and shrivel up on the tree, it's considered ka'akurim. It's no longer considered connected to the tree. It's considered removed from the tree. In what sense? In the sense that now it can be makabel tuma. So when it comes to tuma and tahara, a shriveled up fruit on the tree is ka'akurim. It's considered like it's removed from the tree. Well, you might look at that and you might think, oh, well, in that case, in the context of Hilchas Shabbos, I should be able to pick up, to pluck a dried out fruit from a tree on Shabbos, because it's considered that it's not connected to the tree anymore, so I'm not doing Toilish. Kamash v'lan the Mechaber, no, there's a difference in the Hilchas Tuma and Tara and Hilchas Shabbos. In the context of Hilchas Tuma and Tara, it's ka'akurim, it's considered removed from the tree. In the context of Hilchas Shabbos, it's considered kimechuber, it's considered attached to the tree, and therefore if you pluck it, you are over on Toilish 101, it would be Toilish Daraisa. Says the Mishnah Berurah cutting on hey, bi'ibehen, te'enim sheyavshu bi'ibehen, pirish, what does the word ibehen mean? Pirish b'chiburan ba'anaf, while they are attached to the branch of the tree. Ois cutting on vav. Now, the Mechaber said something interesting. He said, te'enim sheyavshu bi'ibehen, figs that dried up on their stems, if you pluck them, it's a daraisa. V'chein ilon sheyavshu pe'roisa boy. Similarly, a tree whose fruits dried up. What's the difference between these two cases? What's the v'chein? So the Mishnah Berurah gives us two different ways of understanding it. Shir haloshin kenhu. The explanation of the language here is as follows: V'chein hu adin kol ilon sheyavshu v'lav dav keteina. The simple way to understand it is the way I read it when I read it inside. The Mechaber told it to you first in the context of a te'ena, and I believe the reason is because te'enim don't always fall off the tree when they dry out. Then the Mechaber let you know, by the way, I'm not only talking about te'enim, this applies to any fruit tree. The same halacha would apply to any fruit tree. That is the first way to understand this. That is the first way to understand this. Now continues the Mishnah Berurah. Ubenishmas Adam Kasav, the Chai Adam and the Nishmas Adam has a slightly different understanding. He writes, Shatal Seiferhu, that there's actually a textual error over here in Sif Yud Beis. V'tzarich loymar, and really the text should read as follows: V'chein ilon sheyavash, so too a tree that dried out, a tree that died. Ubay peiros, and the tree still has fruit on it. So you have a tree that bore fruit, and then after the tree bore fruit, the tree died, which could happen. Maybe somebody peeled the bark off the tree. So the tree bore fruit, then the elon was yavash, it dried out, it died, but the fruit are still on the tree. So now we have two very different cases. So says the Mishnah Berurah, Lefizeh, according to this Nishmas Adam, Meikar Ra'ash Me'inon, the first case of the Mechaber by the Te'enim teaches us to ha'ilon lach. That's a case where the tree is still a good, live, fresh tree. V'raka perois niskavshu, but the figs that are on the tree dried up. And the Mechaber is telling me, live tree, shriveled figs, If you pick the fig off the tree, that is Toilish Daraisa. And then in the second case, the Mechaber is teaching me that even if the tree died, if you have a dead tree and you have fruit still on it, that's also called Toilish, even though the tree is dead. In both of these cases, we said chayiv. We said this is Toilish Daraisa. You would be chayiv a korban chatos if you did this b'shoigig. Says the Mishnah Berurah. Kosav Magen Avram, the Magen Avram writes, the ba'asavim yaveshim. We're talking here about dried out fruits on a tree. And we're saying that dried out fruits on a tree are still considered connected to the tree. If you pick it, it's Toilish Daraisa. How about grass? How about when you have dead grass? If you pluck dead grass off the ground, is that Toilish Daraisa? Says the Mishnah Berurah. Kasav Magen Avram. The ba'asavim yaveshim, by dead grasses, moidu de ketlushin dami, then everybody would agree that those are already considered uprooted, and it wouldn't be Toilish Daraisa to take it off the ground. Va'atoilish mehem potter. Now remember what potter means in Chelik Gimel. Va'atoilish mehem, somebody who plucks them potter, aval iser derabanan yesh, but it would be asim derabanan, afilu ba'asavim, even by grass. So Toilish Daraisa, it won't be. And I believe the reason for this is that dried grass isn't considered connected to the ground in the context of this halacha because it breaks off the ground very, very easily. It doesn't really have a good attachment to the ground once it's dead. That's what the Mefarshim seem to say. Therefore, Daraisa, it's not going to be Toilish. But it will be an Issa D'Rabbanan because the bottom line is you're still separating something from the ground. So in Issa Daraisa it won't be, but in Issa D'Rabbanan it will be. But then, says the Mishnah Berurah, but you should understand, Lipa'amim, sometimes, yesh gam ken chiyav chatos bazeh. Sometimes, even by asavim yaveshim, even by dried out grasses and other kinds of vegetation, sometimes that will be an Issa Daraisa. Like I write in the Bir Halacha. Now, in the Bir Halacha, it's in the Bir Halacha Dibra Maschel Chayiv. It's a little more than halfway down in that Bir Halacha, where the Chavetz Chaim writes, "Umikamakin Pashahu." It is simple to understand, says the Chavetz Chaim. Dimhu Ara Didei, if it's your land, v'hu Sada Delav Agam, and it's not swampland. Shemisyapa Hakarka Al Yidei Zeh. So therefore, by pulling out these dried grasses, you are improving the ground. Chayiv mishum chayrish afilu al tlisha sasavim kolshu. Points out the Chavetz Chaim. See, the Chavetz Chaim is always doing this. He's covering all the bases. We're saying over here from a Magen Avram, dried grass, not an Isser of Toilish Daraisa. Why? It's not firmly attached to the grass, so it's not a real Toilish. It's Toilish D'Rabbanan, it's not Toilish Daraisa. Points out the Chavetz Chaim, it could be an Isser Daraisa. Not Toilish. It could be a different Issa Daraisa. Which Issa Daraisa? Chayrish. How is it Chayrish? Chayrish is plowing. What does this have to do with plowing? Well, what is plowing essentially? Plowing is an act that you do to improve the ground for further planting. Well, if a farmer has a field and he wants to plant tomatoes in it, so one of the first things he's going to do is he's going to clear it of all vegetation. Even if there's dried grass on it, he's going to make sure to rip up all of that dried grass in order to prepare the land for planting. Well, in that case, if you have such a field and you start ripping out the dry grasses, you're right that it's not an Issa Daraisa of Toilish, but it's an Issa Daraisa of Chayrish. Okay, continues the Mishnah Berurah. Interesting case. Bitzalim, onions. You have to remember that back in the day, they didn't have access to fruits and vegetables the same way we do. They had to keep things and store things for a lengthy amount of time. They had to get onions when they could get them, and then they had to put them into storage, and they had to save them. So apparently, they would sometimes take onions, and they would put them up in the aliyah. They would put them up in the attic. And the attic, it seems, had an earthen floor, or at least there was earth on the floor. Now, you take onions. Even nowadays, you take an onion, you leave it in your pantry long enough, it'll start to sprout. So apparently sometimes they would have onions, they would put them up in the aliyah on the dirt, and they would actually take root in the dirt. Now, you didn't put the onions up there in order to plant them. So your kavanah was not that they should take root. You don't want them to take root. You want them available for the cholent and for the chicken soup. So you didn't intend for them to take root. You don't want them to take root, but they took root. What's the halacha now if you go pick up one of those onions? Is that toilish? Says the Mishnah Berurah, B'tzalim shedarkan lehishtaresh ba'aliyah, onions that sometimes end up taking root in the attic. Sheyesh by ofar, because there's dirt up there. V'nishtarshu sham, and they took root. V'gam roitzah b'hashrashasan. The Mishnah Berurah is addressing a different case. The Mishnah Berurah is addressing a case where you wanted them to take root. I'm not sure why you wanted them to take root, but let's say you wanted them to take root. I don't know, you want to grow onions upstairs in the attic. So you put these onions up there and they took root in the dirt on the floor in the attic. Ha-toilish chayiv. It would be a chayiv of toilish daraisa. Afagav shekala botzel megula ve'in derech gedula mekach. The chiddush over here is, how do onions grow? An onion is a bulb. When you want to plant an onion plant, you take the onion, you bury it, and then it grows leaves coming out of the ground, and more onions grow under the ground. When you want to harvest the onions, you rip up the plant and you pull up the onions from under the ground. So the typical way, the derech gidulan of onions, is for the bulbs that you want, the edible onion, to grow underground and the leaves to grow up above ground. Now, these onions in your attic that took root, they're not buried. You don't have 8 inches of soil on the floor up in your... We're not talking about a case where the onion bulb ended up underground and now it took root, and now it's growing more onions underground. We're talking about a case where you put onions on an earthen floor upstairs, and there was enough earth there that the onion was able to start putting out roots, and it took root. But it's not underground. So says the Mishnah Berurah, you might think that uprooting it is not toilish, because it's not growing the way onions typically grow. Says the Mishnah Berurah, it depends. If for some reason you wanted the onions to take root, then it is toilish. You put it up there, you planted it in an unusual way. If you wanted it to take root and it took root, now if you rip it up, it is going to be an issur of toilish, despite the fact that it's not underground. That's the point. The point is, it's not underground. It's not derech gidulan bekach. When you think of being toilish an onion, you think of ripping an onion out of the ground. Over here, you're not ripping an onion out of the ground. It's sitting up on top of the ground. But it's still toilish because it has taken root, and you wanted it to take root. Avo, im nafla aleid mapolis v'niskasu ha'imoyis shel ha'bitzolim. How about this case? You had onions, and a mapolis, which literally means a building, like fell on it. A mapolis is a collapsed building. So you had a barn, or you had a shed, and you were storing onions in there, and it collapsed. And now onions took root under the collapse. And v'niskasu ha'imois shel ha'bitzolim. Imois shel ha'bitzolim are seed onions. Imois, from the lashon of a mother. Mother onions. These are seed onions. So you had seed onions there. They got covered up in the collapse. So now the onion bulb is covered. And now v'ha'olin megulin kederech gidulan. And now leaves are coming up. Right? So now you have mamish, an onion plant that is growing the way onion plants always grow. The bulb is covered and the leaves are coming up. V'nishtarshu sham, and they take root. Afilu eina roitza b'hashrashasan. In such a case, even if you didn't want them to take root, chayiv k'may shemayu netuin basadeh. And this is Magen Avram, Siv Katan Yudal, B'Shem Chuvas Harash, B'Mishnah Beis, Parakei D'Maisros, Ayijam, B'Mishnah V'Ay B'Shleis Eliyot Sham Tzarchiyun. Basically, what we come out with is like this. If the onions are not growing kederech gidulan, if the onions took root on the floor of the attic, but the bulb is not covered, so it's not growing in the normal fashion, so then it depends. If you wanted them to take root, if you uproot them, it's toilish. If the onions are growing in the normal fashion, they're covered up, the bulb is covered up, and there are sprouts coming up, then even if you didn't want them to take root, toilish is going to be a daraisa. Finally, we said that the Mechaber says the reason he had to tell you this halacha of the shriveled and dried out dates on the tree is because in the context of Hilchas Tumah V'Tara, they're considered separated from the tree. Linyan Tumah is cut Ches Pirish, Tumas Eichlin, Taloi Mekabli Tumah Mechuber. Mechuber can't be Mekabel Tumah, V'zeh Choshev Ketolush. But the fruit that's shriveled on the vine is considered already Tolush, and it could be Mekabel Tumas Eichlin. So you might think the same thing applies to Hilchas Shabbos, Kamash Malon the Mechaber, that it does not. Moving along to Sif Yud Gimel. Sif Yud Gimel is an interesting sif, and it begins, begins and ends. It covers something where shilas come up lamaisa, especially during the summer. Now, we learned at the beginning of the Siman that there's an issur you're not allowed to be mishtamish be'ilan. You're not allowed to make use of a tree. So we learned you're not allowed to climb up into a tree. Why not? Because we're afraid if we're going to let you climb up into a tree, you might come to climb up into a tree and pick an apple. Problem. You're not allowed to hang your hat on a tree. That's called being mishtamish be'ilan. You're using a tree. Why? Again, you hang your hat on a tree. You make use of the tree. We're afraid shemayalav yitlish. You're not allowed to suspend yourself from a tree. So you're not allowed to hang off a branch. Because you do that, you're being mishtamish be'ilan. We're going to see later, you're not allowed to lean your full body weight so that the tree is supporting you. If you would pull away the tree, you'd fall. You're not allowed to lean and support your full body weight on a tree. You're being mishtamish be'ilan. That's a problem. Over here now, the Mechaber is going to discuss what use you're allowed to make from a tree. There are times that there is a certain amount of use that you're allowed to make from a tree and what not. Now, the lashon of the Mechaber is very, very tricky. So there's one rule that we have to remember. We're all familiar with the Aramaic or Hebrew word tzad. I don't mean tzad, tzadi dalet as in trapping. Tzad, a tzad is a side. So when you see the word tzidei ha'ilon, you think of it as the sides of a tree. A tree has sides, right? So the side of the tree trunk. That's tzidei ha'ilon, the side of a tree. The Mechaber is going to use another term as well, and that is stodei. Now you might be tempted to translate the word stodei as sides, like plural of tzad. A tzad is singular, one side of the tree. Stodei are multiple sides of the tree. That's not what the word stodei ilan means in our sif. In our sif, the word tzidei ha'ilan is really going to mean pshutei kamashmai, the side of the tree trunk. Stodei ha'ilan is going to refer not to the side of a tree, but to something that's connected to the tree. So stodei ha'ilan would be, let's say you want to climb up on a ladder, and you want to lean the ladder against the tree. Now, trees are irregularly shaped. It's not always a very nice, straight place to lean a ladder. If you try to lean a ladder on a tree, it might wobble because the tree where you're leaning the ladder is uneven. So you might be tempted to take a 2x4 or a 2x6, screw it into the tree, so now you have a nice straight 2x4 or 2x6, and then lean the ladder on the 2x4 or 2x6. That 2x4 is called stodei ha'ilan. It's something that's attached to the side of the tree. It's not the tree gufa. It's not the etzem ilan. It's not the gufa ilan. It's not the tree itself. It's something connected to the tree. So tzidei ha'ilan, the side of the tree, is the tree itself. The side of the tree. Pshuta k'mashmai. Stodei ha'ilan is something attached to the tree. Now, high level, the halacha that the Mechaber is going to present us with is, you're not allowed to be mishtamish be'ilan. So are you allowed to lean a ladder on a tree on Shabbos? No. Because if you lean a ladder on a tree on Shabbos, you're being mishtamish be'ilan. You're using the tree. You're leaning the ladder on the tree itself. So you're using the tree to support the ladder. So you're not allowed to lean a ladder on a tree on Shabbos. Let's say you take a ladder and you lean it on a tree on Erev Shabbos. On Erev Shabbos, you could lean a ladder on a tree. So you take a ladder and you lean it on the tree on Erev Shabbos. Now on Shabbos itself, are you allowed to go up on that ladder? No, You know why? Because the Mechaber is going to tell us, and these are the opening words of Sif Yud Gimel, Asur lehishtamesh b'tztadei ha'ilan. You're not allowed to use tztadei ha'ilan. What are tztadei ha'ilan? Something attached to the side of the tree, or something that's being supported by the tree. So in our case now, you put the ladder and leaned it against the tree on Erev Shabbos. But, okay, by leaning the ladder on the tree on Erev Shabbos, which was mutter, you turned the ladder into tztadei ha'ilan. Now it is something that is either attached or supported by the tree. And asur lehishtamesh b'tztadei ha'ilan. You're not allowed to use something attached to or supported by a tree on Shabbos. So now, let's break this down. On Shabbos, could you take a ladder and lean it on a tree? No, because then you're being mishtamish with the Elon itself. You're using the tree to support the ladder. You're not allowed to do that on Shabbos. Are you allowed to lean a ladder on a tree on Erev Shabbos? Yeah, go ahead. Now, if the ladder is leaning on the tree from Erev Shabbos, could you go up the ladder on Shabbos? No, that would be mishtabish b'tztadei ha'ilan. You're using something supported by the tree. Not allowed to do that. That would be a problem. So against this backdrop, let's take a look at the Mechaber here in Sif Yud Gimel. Says the Mechaber, third line down, Kuf Pei Beis Amud Aleph. Asur lehishtamesh b'tztadei ha'ilan. You're not allowed to make use of something attached or supported by a tree. Aval betzidei tztadin mutter. But if we remove one more degree from the tree, then it would be mutter. What's that case? Very simple. I brought it up earlier. You have a tree, and ultimately you want to lean a ladder on the tree. Okay? But the tree is uneven. So you take a nice piece of 2x6 and you screw it to the tree. Now you have a nice straight piece of wood attached to the tree that you can lean a ladder on. Okay, what is that 2x6? That's tztadei ha'ilan. It's something attached to the tree. Okay, so now you have tree, and now you have 2x6, which is tztadei ha'ilan. On Shabbos, can you take a ladder and lean it on the 2x6? No. If you lean a ladder on the 2x6 on Shabbos, you're being mishtamesh b'tztadei ha'ilan. You're using the 2x6 to support the ladder. That's being mishtamesh b'tztadei ha'ilan. You're not allowed to do that. So you took your 2x6, you screwed it to the tree on Erev Shabbos. Now on Shabbos, you want to take the ladder, lean it on the 2x6? Can't do that. You're being mishtamesh b'tztadei ha'ilan. But now let's doctor the case a little bit. Let's say on Erev Shabbos, you screwed the 2x6 to the tree. And now on Erev Shabbos, you took a ladder, and you leaned it on the 2x6. Okay, tree, 2x6 is tztadei ha'ilan. Ladder is tzidei tztadin. The ladder is 1 degree removed. Now the ladder is something which is being supported by the tztadei ha'ilan. Now on Shabbos, you could go up the ladder. Because when you go up the ladder on Shabbos, you're not being mishtamish b'tztadei ha'ilan. You're not directly using the 2x6 that's attached to the tree. Are you using it? Is it supporting your weight? Yes. But you're not climbing on the 2x6. You're not making direct use of the 2x6, which is tztadei ha'ilan. What are you making direct use of? The ladder. The ladder is not tztadei ha'ilan. The ladder is not attached to the tree. The ladder is not supported by the tree directly. The ladder is leaning on the 2x6, and it is directly supported by the 2x6. So the ladder is tzidei tztadin. You're allowed to use tzidei tztadin. That basically is the part of this sif that we're going to learn today. Let's read it inside. Also, lehishtamesh b'tztadei ha'ilan. You're not allowed to make use out of something attached to or supported by a tree. Avo b'tzidei tztadin mutter. But if you want to use something that's attached to or supported by something that is attached or supported by the tree, that's mutter. Lefikach, therefore, says the Mechaber, what I just told you. Lefikach, asur lismai chasulam litzidei ha'ilan. Even on Erev Shabbos, I'm reading it to you the way the Mishnah Berurah is going to explain it. And the Mishnah Berurah says that the lashon is a little bit megumgum here. The language of the Mechaber is a little bit imprecise. Lefikach, asur lismai chasulim litzidei ha'ilan. Even on Erev Shabbos, you're not allowed to lean a ladder on the tzidei ha'ilan. Tzidei ha'ilan, the side of the tree itself. On Erev Shabbos, you're not allowed to take a ladder and lean it on the tree and then use it on Shabbos. The chisolik, you're allowed to put it there on Erev Shabbos, but you're not allowed to put it there on Erev Shabbos and then use it on Shabbos. Why? The chisolik bay, because when you go up the ladder, mishamish b'tzadin. Again, the ladder is leaning on the tree. So tree, ladder leaning on the tree, the ladder is tzadei ilan. On Shabbos, if you climb up that ladder, you're being mishtamish b'tzadei ilan, and that's usher. Aval, however, im yesh yosei tekua b'tzadei ilan, but if there's a peg driven into the tree, or the case that I gave you, there's a piece of a 2x6 screwed into the tree, muter lismach sulam alav, you're allowed to lean a tree against that 2x6, when? On Erev Shabbos. Not on Shabbos, because to lean the ladder on that 2x6 on Shabbos, you're using the 2x6. The 2x6 is stadei ilan. You're not allowed to be mishtamish, but stadei ilan on Shabbos. But what the Becharmi means is, muter lismak sulam alav on Erev Shabbos. On Erev Shabbos, you could lean a ladder on the piece of 2x6 to have a layosei stadin, because now the piece of 2x6 is stadei ilan, v'sulam stidei stadin. And now the ladder becomes tzidei tzadin, so you could climb up the ladder on Shabbos because you're 1 degree removed. It's tzidei tzadin. Let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah cut notes. B'tzadei ha'ilan. Pirish. What are tzadei ilan? Davar hatachuv aikashur be'ilan. Something that is stuck into or tied to a tree, or supported by the tree, mikrit stadei ilan. That's called stadei ha'ilan. Aval dafnei ha'ilan atzmai, but the walls of the tree itself, loy mikrit stadin. That's not called stadei ha'ilan. Elo gufa ilanhu. That's tree. The side of the tree is tree. It's not stadei ha'ilan. V'tzidei stadin. What's tzidei stadin? Hu davar hanishan bedavar hatachuv be'ilan. That's something leaning on something that's attached to the tree. So again, tree, that's tree. The wall of the tree is tree. The 2x6, stadei ilan. The ladder leaning on the 2x6, tzidei stadin. V'chein mispar b'divrei ha'mechaber l'kamei. Ois katan samach. Aser lismai chasulam. The words of the mechaber were, you're not allowed to lean a ladder on the side of the tree. Because if you do that, when you go up on the ladder, you're using stadei ilan. Explains the Mishnah Berurah. This lashon is not very precise. The shir advarim, the explanation of the words is as follows: De'ein lismach sulam le'ilan me erev Shabbos. You're not allowed to go ahead and lean a ladder against a tree on erev Shabbos, la'alois alav b'Shabbos, so that you could go up onto the ladder on Shabbos. Techisalik pay, because if you do that, you'll be using the tzadei ilan, and it's like I explained it to you. You can't lean the ladder against the tree on Erev Shabbos and then go up on it on Shabbos, because by leaning the ladder on the tree, you made the ladder tzadei ilan, because it's being supported by the tree. And now if you go up on it on Shabbos, you're being mishtamish, but tzadei ilan, and that would be aser. V'lisbay chasulim b'Shabbos pavadei aser. To lean the ladder on the tree on Shabbos is definitely aser. Why? Because when you lean the ladder on the tree on Shabbos, you're not using tzadei ilan, you're using the ilan. If you take a ladder and you set it up and lean it against a tree on Shabbos, what are you doing? You're using the tree. You're using the tree to support the ladder. Not only that, if you screwed the 2x6 to the tree on Erev Shabbos, and now on Shabbos you want to lean the ladder on the 2x6, that's also aser. Why? Because tree, 2x6 is stadei ilan. If you lean a ladder against the 2x6 / stadei ilan, you're being mishtamish b't stadei ilan. You're using the 2x6 to support your ladder. Now how to do that? Mishtamish b't stadei ilan. Tezeu gufa mishtamish b't stadei ilan mikri. Ois katan samach aleph. The mechaber said you can't lean the ladder on the tzidei ilan. What does tzidei ilan mean? Pirish l'dafnoi. It means the walls of the tree. Ice cut and samach beis, the mechaber said, but mutter lismay chalav, if you have a 2x6 connected to the tree, then you're allowed to lean a ladder against it. When? When are you allowed to lean a ladder on the 2x6 connected to the tree? Hainu demutar lismay sulamay erev Shabbos. You're allowed to lean a ladder against the 2x6 on the tree on erev Shabbos, la loy salav b'Shabbos, so that you can go up on the ladder on Shabbos. Mishum de have a yaseid. Why? Because then tree yaseid 2x6 is stadei ilan. You put the ladder on it on erev Shabbos. That makes the ladder tzideit stadin. Now on Shabbos you can go up the ladder because it's mutter to be mishtamish. But tzideit stadin v'yizar shelo yaniach raglei ala yaseid. However, when you climb up the ladder, make sure you don't step on the 2x6. El al shlavei asulam. Make sure your feet stay on the rungs of the ladder and they don't stray and go onto the 2x6. Because if they go onto the 2x6, kadei shelo yimishtamshin b'stadin. If they go onto the 2x6, the 2x6 is stadei ilan that you're not allowed to be mishtamish by. We're going to stop over here. We'll continue weiter. Next time, thank you so much for joining me for Limud HaTorah. The source of Limud HaTorah should be begging against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe Shem should send Yeshua, Refuas, Parnas, and Shiddukim to those in need. We should be zeichet to see the B'yeskel Tzedek, B'mher v'yameinu Amen. Be well.